It is a joy to be here with you the second time this year. I hope you remember my first talk. We talked about my youthful heroes, and I think you may, no doubt you are expecting me to open with a saying about Vladimir Lenin, as I did last time. So what can Lenin tell us about consciousness, morality? Not much, actually. I checked. In one of his texts, the tasks of the youth leagues, Vladimir states, "We say that our morality is entirely subordinated to the interests of the proletariat's class struggle." End quote. This means that any morality based on extra-human and what he calls extra-class concepts, like the ethics based on God's commandments, is a, quote, deception, dupery, and stultification of the oppressed by the oppressors. But if you understand morality in this way, that is, as reduced to something material, namely one class and its problems, you will be enslaved by its will and ideology. Your morality will be, as Nietzsche called it, a slave morality, as distinguished from a noble morality. According to Nietzsche, the slave morality is based on the no directed to everything that is outside, everything different, other, everything not self. On the other hand, in a healthy morality, the I acts and grows spontaneously, saying yes to itself in its encounter with the other. In his call to re-evaluate moral values, however, Nietzsche considered the moral norms, the whole legal system, as entirely produced by man. This production of norms included making values or interpreting them into value-indifferent phenomena, as Scheler points out in his evaluation of Nietzsche. Scheler rejected Nietzschean grasp of morality also on the basis that the value of human life is not the highest value, as is known from experience concerning the values of the community or the holy. In an attempt to reject Kant's idealistic moral imperatives, Scheler himself developed a duty-free moral system in which objective values themselves, which man experiences already in a certain hierarchy, provide the sufficient motivation for moral action and the establishment of moral norms. Let me mention two more thinkers whose thought I find relevant to our topic today. In his The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis argues against disregarding or rejecting the norm or the reality of the Tao, as he calls it, which for our purposes we can call the transcendent universal moral norm or norms, to which man should subject himself in order to be fully human, fully man. Lewis considers the abolition of this moral norm and consequently the reliance on one's own impulses for valuation and action, the abolition of humanity in its essence. The loss of the norm means for Lewis the loss of the ability to distinguish the hierarchy of values, and consequently it means the loss of the guiding principle for human action. Joseph Ratzinger captures the problem in the theological context. In his introduction to Christianity, he makes a well-known claim that with God being made irrelevant in man's life, man's own dignity suffers. Applied to moral life, this claim means that without the author of the norm of morality, this norm loses its grounding. Therefore, he says that faith, it's quote, faith in the Logos, the Word in the beginning, understands moral values as responsibility, as a response to the Word, and thus gives them their intelligibility as well as their essential orientation, end quote. This understanding of moral values coincides with that of Wojtyła, for whom, quote, to imbue the various aspects of life with moral values is to fill them with the Spirit of Christ, end quote. I presented this brief and certainly non-exhaustive pendulum overview of various approaches to morality for several reasons. First, I wished to show the importance of morality for human and Christian life alike. Morality is an interior existential reality in which the human person experiences the moral facts, such as responsibility, duty, guilt, the moral value of a particular act, etc. Nonetheless, Wojtyła understands morality both in its individual and social dimensions, as human life seen from the perspective of moral norms. Since, according to Wojtyła, the moral norm is the truth about the good, it transcends moral experiential facts. In general, he defines the moral norm to be the principle of being a good man and acting well. Second, my introductory reflections show that morality, or rather its experience, is revelatory for our understanding of ourselves as persons. Wojtyła is convinced about a close union between the human and the moral, between anthropology and ethics, thus consequently between the experience of man and the experience of morality. In a letter to one of his scholar friends, Karol Wojtyła writes, quote, "I have never lost the conviction that the personal world of these values, namely moral values, their immanence in action, in a sense most deeply reveals man in himself, in his interior drama, manifesting the proper measure of his personal greatness," end quote. In other words, the experience of morality manifests man in what is most essentially human. Hence, Wojtyła says that the fact of the becoming of moral value, the Fieri of the moral value, in human acts, the dynamic Fieri of moral value, reveals, quote, "reveals the person to us even more deeply and thoroughly than the act itself," end quote. This conviction underlies his entire masterpiece, Person and Act, even though he places the ethical subject matter, including the study of moral values, outside of his anthropological reflections for the sake of clarity. So he calls it bracketing. Finally, the brief outline of various views on morality shows two principles integral to our discussion concerning the role of consciousness in morality. We see that morality has to do with something external or transcendent, such as living conditions, the moral norm, and something interior to man, such as his reason, will, consciousness. My goal is to show how Wojtyła integrates these two principles in his anthropological and ethical vision without absolutizing any of them. I am interested mostly in the relation of consciousness to the moral value. Hence, I will not discuss the problem of conscience, since the acts of consciousness have a different orientation to those of conscience. The reflections, the latter seek and judge about the truth, about the good of particular actions. Besides, the issue of conscience is implicated in my discussion of the moral norm, and we will hear about conscience later during the day. Also, I will not speak about the will and its goodness. This topic was mentioned by Father Kupczak, and this topic is somewhat implicated in my section on conscious efficacy in human acts, which I will talk about soon. In my reflections, I will use methods employed by Wojtyła himself, namely metaphysical reduction and phenomenological insight. So, according to Karol Wojtyła, the becoming of moral value in a human subject depends on three main conditions. The moral value cannot exist in man without, one, his conscious efficacy as is actualized in human acts, two, his personal relation to the norm of morality, and three, this efficacy and moral norm as they are reflected and interiorized by consciousness. Let me now describe all three conditions in more detail, starting with consciousness. Due to time limitations, let me emphasize only a couple of points in Wojtyła's understanding of consciousness, points that concern the transcendent and immanent character of consciousness with respect to the human person, his acts, and his values. In some sense, this was already covered yesterday by Father Kupczak. Yes, the first point concerns the non-substantial character of consciousness. Consciousness is a cognitive mental function of the person, according to Wojtyła. In Person and Act, Wojtyła states that, quote, consciousness itself does not exist as a substantial subject of acts of consciousness. It exists neither as a separate suppositum nor as a power, end quote. Instead, consciousness possesses a functional character. It is a function of the acting man, of the whole man. Let me offer a couple proofs to justify this view. First, consciousness does not always actually appear in a particular human person. There can exist a man who either temporarily or permanently does not use consciousness. However, when consciousness appears, it is always in man, in a being who is endowed with human nature, that is, with the capacity for conceptual thinking. That's what Wojtyła stresses, that consciousness comes together with conceptual thinking. It's not sensual consciousness, it is what he calls mental consciousness. Second, Wojtyła counts the non-conscious source of contents experienced by man, namely the subconscious, as that which indicates a structural primacy of ontological potentiality with respect to consciousness. That is, both consciousness and the subconscious must inhere in some existing suppositum, in a suppositum that already exists. Finally, Wojtyła claims that our own experience tells us that consciousness is not a subject that cognizes, strives, or desires. So these acts, what Wojtyła calls intentional acts, acts of knowing, willing, these are not acts of consciousness. Instead, all this cognition, thinking, and action, striving, are merely reflected in consciousness. We experience our cognitive acts, even when they are mirrored in consciousness, as proceeding from man, as finding their source in man and not merely in consciousness. It is our being, not just our consciousness, that strives for its perfection by being turned to pursuing the good proper to it. If you take the consciousness by itself, you will not be able to tell what is its perfection. Experience verifies that the human person is a possible contingent creature that needs other beings for its actualization and perfection. And within that understanding, Wojtyła understands consciousness, the will, reason, and so on. The second point concerns the non-intentional and subjectivizing aspect of consciousness. Wojtyła distinguishes consciousness from cognition, understanding and volition. The acts of cognition are intentional. They turn to objects in order to understand them or pursue them as ends. They place objects vis-à-vis the I. Although consciousness is also a sort of cognition, according to Wojtyła, it has no intentional character. It does not juxtapose objects against the subject, but grasps the connection between the subject's particular acts and the very subject, where these acts find their source. The proper object of consciousness is the subject of cognition, is man. It is the I as the existing and acting subject to which my consciousness turns. Perhaps it is better to say that consciousness, in a sense, encompasses the subject and follows all its activities, whether cognitive or appetitive, internal or external. However, consciousness does not objectivize the acts and the person who performs them. Consciousness is united to the I without objectivizing it. Rather, Wojtyła speaks of consciousness as subjectivizing, precisely by forming lived experience. Thanks to it, the person experiences himself as a subject as the subjective I, and he experiences the acts that he performs as his own acts. All right, so let's look at consciousness and its relation to human acts, which is very important for us for the topic of understanding how the moral value is present in the human subject. What is of most interest to us out of all the areas that consciousness reaches in man's natural dynamics is the area of human action. It is so because morality would not be possible without human acts. We would be justified in saying that the human act is action thanks to which man owes his moral value. It is these acts that possess the moral value, they are good or evil, which is then transferred onto the whole human person. In some sense, this lecture concerns this transference, the transference of the moral value from the act onto the person. Now, Wojtyła emphasizes the moment of efficacy in human acts as the moment that conditions morality. The moral value can exist in man because he is conscious of his efficacious engagement in action. Morality does not relate to that which simply happens in man without his efficacious engagement and without the lived experience of this engagement, which we know is enabled by the second function of consciousness. For this reason, in order to discover the relation between consciousness and the Fieri of moral value, we must first examine the relation between consciousness and human acts. Right away, Wojtyła observes that consciousness is something external in relation to the human act and to man's efficacious engagement in this act. The act is not created out of consciousness or even in consciousness. However, although the human act is formed outside consciousness, it is formed and progresses in its scope so that consciousness can reflect it or mirror it. As such, consciousness only mirrors human acts, but itself does not belong to the subject of action, as for example the body does, and does not have an internal share in the action of this subject, even though this does not preclude some subjective contribution of consciousness to the act, which we will just talk about in a moment. Consciousness, so to speak, only accompanies the human act. By this, Wojtyła simply wishes to stress that consciousness is not an independent subject that acts or creates action or is the source of any operation in the human person, such as thinking or willing. This reflective function guards against such misunderstanding. Wojtyła calls this function of consciousness by various names: mirroring, reflective, trans-illuminating. In the earlier writings, he also called it accompanying, because it accompanies the human acts. Nonetheless, Wojtyła asks a very intriguing question about the role of consciousness in human acts. Does consciousness reside simply outside of the human act and man's efficacious engagement in it by merely mirroring this engagement? If consciousness is completely external to human action, we could speak only about an act or engagement that was made conscious. On the other hand, if consciousness inheres in this efficacious engagement as its interior property and qualification, as Wojtyła says, we could also speak of a conscious act or a conscious engagement. This is precisely what Wojtyła recognizes in the second function of consciousness, which he calls reflexive, or in his earlier writing, co-creating. Not only does it complement the mirroring function, but also bestows on consciousness its proper raison d'être. This is the function that forms lived experience. Consciousness not only mirrors that which man encounters outside and inside himself, but above all interiorizes or subjectivizes that which it mirrors by introducing all its content into one's own eye. And Wojtyła, by the way, distinguishes between interiorizing and subjectivizing functions of consciousness, but let's, for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that It's the same. This introduction of everything that is the content of consciousness into one's own I is accomplished by lived experience that consciousness forms. That is, in other words, consciousness introduces its content into the orbit of lived experience and the psychological subjectivity connected with it. This reflexive function of consciousness marks the second relation between consciousness and morality. In this relation, consciousness appears as a quasi-subject, in which the moral value of acts and the men performing these acts are first formed and only then mirrored. And I know this quasi-subjectivity, and this is the phrase that Wojtyła uses. I know it may be confusing, but that does not mean, of course, that consciousness is a suppositum, which we just identified earlier. Meaning suppositum, meaning an objective subject of being and action. But due to the organic closeness between the human being and consciousness, Wojtyła does not understand consciousness as merely something totally abstract in relation to the subject man, but as something in which all that lives in man is, quote, being accomplished, unquote. Now let's look at consciousness and the moral value. Now these two ways in which consciousness relates to human acts determine the ways in which consciousness relates to moral value, which informs the acting subject. In the first case, when consciousness reflects human acts, it also reflects the moral value in them. Hence, it is transcendent to these acts and this value. According to Wojtyła, this function of consciousness is easily recognizable. Consciousness witnesses that the subject performed a particular act and that the moral value bound with this act became the property of the acting subject. In addition, we also are conscious of the freedom of action. In some sense, we can call it self-determination, but there's more to it, of course, than that we are able to act and, in fact, are the efficient cause of our action. We are also conscious that we could act differently or even opposite to this particular act. All these points help us to see that the moral value and morality in general is not a property of consciousness. In other words, the moral value does not find its exclusive origin in consciousness. Consciousness does not produce this value. For consciousness always mirrors this value as a property of the act and a property of the acting subject. So we can say that the proper focus of locus of moral values and their becoming in is the human act and the agent of this act, man. Summarizing, Wojtyła writes, quote, "The witness of consciousness is thoroughly realistic at this stage. We are conscious of our acts as the result of the efficacious engagement of the subject. And in close connection with this and in dependence on this, we are also conscious of the moral value." End quote. In the second case, when consciousness is immanent with respect to human acts, the moral value is shaped and crystallized, as Wojtyła says, in consciousness. Here, Wojtyła sees consciousness as not only reflecting but also conditioning the freedom of action. Hence, this freedom, this self-determination, is a real property of the human act, as a real property of the human act is conditioned by consciousness, is its consequence. The Polish thinker writes, quote, "The act is made conscious by us as free, that is, as containing the person's efficacy and self-determination insofar as this act is conscious." End quote. I hope to publish this piece so you can review it later. Consciousness here is intrinsic and organic with respect to the act and its moral value. It is not just the subject of reflection, but also the property of action. Wojtyła summarizes, then, the twofold role of consciousness with respect to the transference of the moral value unto man himself as follows. quote, "The proper link between consciousness and morality consists in the fact that consciousness mirrors the moral value as contained in the human acts, whose property is consciousness. Because these acts are reflected in consciousness as the result of the person's efficacious engagement and his self-determination, then the moral value as a fact is also mirrored as a property of the person." End quote. Okay, I planned on skipping this section, but I will present it anyway. It's on the Fieri of moral value and freedom. We can see that the Fieri of the moral value in the human person is conditioned by consciousness, but that this Fieri cannot take place unless there is the freedom of action in man, namely that which Wojtyła calls self-determination, that is determining myself in the moral sense, that is, I have the ability to become good or evil by my own acts. It is this freedom that constitutes the basis for the moral value in man. Without this freedom and the consciousness of it, there can be no such value becoming to exist in the human act and naturally in the person. Wojtyła opposes this vision of the Fieri of the moral value to one where freedom is a postulate to be done, like in Kant, or the end of morality, like in Kant or Sartre. According to Wojtyła, it is morality, the moral value, that is the end of action in a certain sense. You becoming good or evil is the meaning of what you do. To which freedom, so it is the end of action to which freedom is only a condition and means, not vice versa. So the freedom, he would say, is the means and not the end. This insight is particularly valuable for understanding the Church's normative teaching. For example, Wojtyła's interpretation of the teaching of Pope Paul VI encyclical Humanae Vitae comes to mind. Once we understand, as does Wojtyła, that the encyclical does not presuppose human freedom to be the end of morality, but merely the foundation of the properly human action of the spouses, all the norms that the encyclical proposes and its emphasis on chastity become to make more sense. It is also because the human person's fulfillment is constituted by becoming morally good, that is, good as man, not under any aspect, but as such. Okay, moving on to a section on the moral value and the norm. The freedom of action, as is exercised by conscious efficacy, is not the only element that contributes to the becoming of the moral value and its appearance in consciousness. We are also conscious of another moment, namely that in my action I discover that I should actualize this possibility rather than that one. In other words, I discover that my action is conditioned by some normative reality. Wojtyła calls this reality duty and relates it to the moral norm, by which he understands a certain truth that is transcendent to the lived experience of values and duty and is not reduced to them. In fact, in the becoming of the moral value, the conditioning by freedom relates to the conditioning by the norm as the potential moment to the actual one. Freedom simply enables the conformation to or the divergence from the norm of morality. It is thanks to the norm that the consciousness of acting in this or that way transitions into the consciousness of a duty to act this or that way. Again, consciousness does not produce the norm, as it does not produce the action or values, but mirrors it and introduces them into the structure of the moral fact. In order to understand the moral value fully, we must disengage ourselves from and transcend the aspect of consciousness, even though it is consciousness that allows the moral value to find its proper place in the human subject, as we just saw. Wojtyła distinguishes, and I'm coming to a closure of the lecture before my conclusion, Wojtyła distinguishes two central moments or phases of the norm appearing in consciousness. The first moment, which is actually secondary, is the formation of the interior mandate, a concrete practical command. You should do this, or you should do that, or you shouldn't do this or that. This moment is accompanied by the primary one, the moment of truth, which is properly normative for Wojtyła. This or that is good, or this or that is evil. The norm appears in consciousness as the truth about human being and his acting. Consciousness reflects the gradual shift of the moment of value, A is good, into the moment of duty, I should do A. This entire normative shift takes place in conscience. According to Wojtyła, conscience is that which introduces the person's transcendent orientation to the good, truth, and beautiful into what is immanent in him. And what is immanent in him for Wojtyła means what is natural. What is natural. According to Wojtyła, thanks to the connection between the norm and the freedom of doing this or that, on the one hand, and this connection being reflected in consciousness, on the other hand, every moral fact includes man's consciousness not only as mirroring, but as immanent cofactor of this reality. Now, since everything is clear now, I can move on to the conclusion. On the one hand, just to repeat, consciousness is external and transcendent to human acts when it merely reflects or mirrors them. In this case, the moral value is reflected in consciousness as a content that is separated from the subject, in a certain sense. Wojtyła is clear that although the moral fact is reflected in consciousness, it is not accomplished in it. Instead, the Fieri of the moral value is realized outside of the consciousness in the real subject, man. It is on the basis of this subject's conscious action that the moral value originates. Consciousness reveals to us this whole reality that takes place. On the other hand, however, consciousness is immanent in the human acts. It inheres in each of them. In this case, the moral value is formed and crystallized in consciousness. And this is language of Wojtyła, formed and crystallized. And if this is the case, consciousness is capable of reflecting the Fieri of the moral value in the subject man. It is thanks to consciousness in its twofold function that moral values reside in man, that man experiences the moral value of his acts as his own value. Again, without consciousness, the moral value, either good or evil, would not be assimilated in the subject, like it is not assimilated in animals, which are devoid of consciousness, the mental consciousness. Now, a few notes on the person in general. So I'd like to. I'm almost at the very end, and this is to reflect on the title of our conference, which says "Approaching the Mystery of the Person." So my brief reflections highlighted three areas of this mystery, and I do not claim that I'm going to reveal to you the full mystery of the person. It is not possible. But I simply want to note three areas. First, the human person acts in freedom, in self-determination, in the context of his whole being's striving for fulfillment and perfection in the ontological and axiological dimensions. That's why Wojtyła talks about, by the way, about the will not being just a faculty, but being a property of the person. The person is not simply a being that changes, but the one who determines himself in action. Sorry. Yes, that's true. Simply the changes, but who determines himself in freedom. That is, he becomes good or evil as a person through his own acts. What is important in Wojtyła's concept of human freedom and dynamism is that the person is a suppositum, the subject of being and action, that from the beginning the person, this being, possesses a personal existence, personal esse. So even though sometimes consciousness is not used, is not revealed in a particular person, when, let's say, the person is very small baby in the mother's womb, or is sick and old, it is still a person. Second, the person achieves this fulfillment and perfection in a dialogue with the other. To be a person means to be open to receive this other into one's own eye, and to shape one's life in light of this encounter. So you can think about any interaction with another human being, any interaction with another being. You can think of marriage, for example, about the spousal love. Theologically speaking, this dialogue progresses by welcoming the word of this other into one's own heart. That is, by embracing the properly Christian ethos. By which I mean, it's a theological context, by which I mean accepting the word of God into your own heart. Wojtyła is not afraid to see the fullness of human life dependent on the gift of the other, as he also recognizes that the beginning of this life is due to such a gift as well. And this is what we emphasize at the Institute here. Finally, personhood means interior life, a life that is experienced and cultivated consciously. An essential trait of this personalism is his focus on human subjectivity, or as Wojtyła calls it, that which is irreducible in man. Wojtyła understands every person to be a concrete I that is conscious of himself and acts consciously. A fully personal life demands consciousness, thanks to which man can experience himself and his moral value. It is by acquiring the positive moral value, moral goodness, that the human person and his life become more human. Thank you.